All right, welcome to the Nietzsche Dialogues. I'm here with philosopher Alexander Bard. If you've been watching, this is part of a much larger conversation series on Friedrich Nietzsche's work and trying to bring him into dialogue with the present moment. We've talked about Christianity. We've talked about Nietzsche as a worldview. We've talked about Nietzsche in conversation with mimetic theory, Girardian analysis. We've brought Nietzsche into conversation with contemporary views on nihilism and postmodernism, as well as conversations about Nietzsche's relationship with women. And today we're going to be discussing with Alexander Bard the future of Nietzsche, or Nietzschean futures. Another way of thinking about this is Nietzsche as an incomplete project or an incomplete paradigmatics. We're going to talk about some of the ways in which we might want to extend and continue to work with Nietzsche into the 21st century. And I think that conversation is not only a great way to end this dialogue series, but also a great way to once again introduce the course on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which will be starting on, or at least the final sign-up day will be on July 15th. And you can find out more about that course at philosophyportal.online. It's going to be a fantastic opportunity to work closely with me over the course of the summer, 9 weeks, 6 classes in 3 different tiers, where you can not only learn deeply about the cracks and crevices of Nietzsche's philosophy, but also contribute to the future of philosophy yourself. We're going to be working towards a collective student-led conference and student-led anthology, just like we did with the Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit course. All right, so with that opening, Alexander Bard, no stranger to this channel, welcome back. Great to have you on, man. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And I should say that I'm specifically then not here as a Nietzschean scholar. I'm here really as a practicing Nietzschean philosopher, which is quite different. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to look at what we can do with Nietzsche as an unfinished philosopher in the 21st century.
Right on. Bard and Nietzsche, incomplete paradigmatics. But before we get into sort of the way in which we might want to extend Nietzsche, I think it would be really helpful for both myself and the viewers to sort of get a deeper view on how you understand the foundations of Nietzsche himself. One of the reasons why I think this would be really unique and special coming from you as a philosopher is because you're also a very open Zoroastrian. And Nietzsche was hugely influenced by the figure of Zoroaster. So I think we should take this, or at least I want to take this opportunity to sort of get your perspective on the link between Zoroaster and the character Zarathustra and how Nietzsche is thinking about this.
Well, let's start with saying that the internet did not exist in Germany in the 19th century. So if you were around, you were a scholar like Nietzsche or Hegel before him, you had plenty of time to read books. And these guys were real scholars. They spoke many languages. They spoke ancient languages. They knew what they were talking about. And ever since the late 1700s, there was a high fashion in Germany and in England for Iranian culture. So Iranian culture arrived together with Indian culture, and the exploration of Iranian culture was, of course, driven by archaeology. It was also driven by all the old texts arriving, the old Iranian texts, just like the Indian and the Chinese texts were arriving in Europe. They're being translated. People tried to understand them. And this was high fashion in Germany in the early 19th century. So both Hegel and Nietzsche had read about the historical character Zoroaster, who founded Zoroastrianism about 1700 before Christ. It's often credited as the oldest monotheistic religion, but there's way more to it than that. I would say that actually Zoroaster, if anything, invented philosophy rather than invented monotheistic religion. Zoroaster's own religion that he started practicing in Persia, in Central Asia, 1700 before Christ, is called Mazdayasna in ancient Persian. Mazdayasna meaning philosophy. It becomes philosophia in Greece about 1200 years later. So we need to put that time frame on here, that Greek philosophy really starts with the Persians. And it was my studies that convinced me in the 1980s that the right thing to do would be to convert to Nietzsche religion eventually. We're going to return to that later in this conversation about the necessity of dividing Sutra and Tantra, which is lacking in Western culture, which fundamentally is what's wrong with Western culture. And Nietzsche was getting at this without fully getting onto this. He was getting at this. And for me personally, that meant that I had to convert either to Buddhism which is the Indian tradition, Taoism, which is a Chinese tradition, or Zoroastrianism, which is the Iranian tradition of the same sort of tantric religion that we these days call the Silk Route Triad. I decided to convert, and I did so in 1992. I was one of the first Westerners in modern time who converted to Zoroastrianism. Now there are thousands. So, I just basically, I was one of the guys who opened that door. But going back to the figure of Zoroaster, we have to remember that Zoroaster has a Greek equivalent, although he was probably not even Greek, and that's Heraclitus. And as you probably know, Heraclitus was the great hero of Nietzsche against Plato. So Nietzsche takes sides with Heraclitus against Plato fundamentally among the Greek philosophers. Heraclitus being the philosopher of flux, being the original dialectician, many other things. And Plato looks more and more like a pale copy of Heraclitus afterwards, except that with Heraclitus, we only got or Heraclitus in Greek, we only got the fragments. We have very little text, versus Plato, we have lots of well-written books afterwards that we can study, and with Aristotle even more so. But if you look at the thought patterns that Nietzsche sympathized with when he went into the real Greek discovery, which was tragedy and drama. Philosophy was discovered by the Persians, but if the Persians discovered and created philosophy as an art form, then certainly drama and tragedy is what we should credit the Greeks with. And this was something Nietzsche saw through his deep studies. So he didn't pick the Zarathustra character, out of nowhere. Even writes about it in Ecce Homo, where he's obviously about to go mentally insane, but at least he's honest. Ecce Homo is his sort of insane attempt at writing an autobiography. But Ecce Homo even writes that the beginning and the end of morality, or today would say the beginning and the end of ethics, the beginning and the end of value production is Zoroaster. That there is no beyond Zoroaster, the historical character of Zoroaster. So for me, Zoroastrianism being a purely ethical religion or a purely ethical philosophy without morality, we can get to that later, is what interests me. So what Nietzsche gets more than anything from Zoroaster, which we're concerned with here, speaking about Nietzsche for the future, is the difference between heroism and victimhood. And this is fundamental to Nietzsche, the most important aspect of his work. This is the amor fati. If I'm heroic enough every morning to get up and meditate and contemplate on the world and accept everything as it is, Hegel would say, accept everything that has happened until this very moment as a necessity, and then force myself to love it. Amor fati. I love fate. Then I can only be heroic from that moment on, because then that opens up to a future where I actually am co-creating that future, whatever else is involved in that co-creation. This is fundamental to Nietzsche. The real value can only come from the heroic stance. So he's very opposed to Rousseau, one of his many enemies. And he's opposed to the idea that you can have grievances and run around with your grievances and cherish your resentment, that you can afford to do that. To Nietzsche, the person who runs around being resentful is not only poison to all of society, it's also poison to himself. It is impossible in an existential way to become a proper Nietzschean without being heroic. And to be heroic is to every day get up in the morning and fight whatever inside of you that wants to become a victim, because being a victim is the easy way out. Being heroic takes huge effort. But this is fundamental to Nietzsche. And this goes all the way back to Zoroastrianism. This is where the Zoroastrian roots in Nietzsche lie. Spinoza and other guys also introduced Zoroastrian thinking later to the West. But what comes through in Nietzsche is what the Zoroastrians call Asha and Druj. And Asha is the willingness in making the effort to be on the constructive side of history. So you have a constructive mindset at all times, which of course starts with accepting everything as it is, to then possibly influence the future. And here you can see how also Hegel was influenced by Zoroaster, who Hegel gladly credited for being, the original major thinker. And Hegel and Nietzsche are both in this sense Zoroastrian because their ethics is completely Zoroastrian in this aspect. So the Asha versus Drui are just the Zoroastrian words for Asha is heroic, or to be with things as they are. Tao in Taoism is the same thing, and Artha in Indian philosophy. And then the other aspect is to cherish your victimhood, or to be resentful and let a resentment grow inside of you. And that's called Druj. in Zoroastrianism, and that's of course what Nietzsche is opposed to as well, and what he finds a lot of in Christianity. When he attacks Christianity and says that it's a slave morality, it is because Christianity thrives on a victimhood cult that Nietzsche refused to be part of.
Like the way you're framing this, I was gonna ask, do these ideas of the heroism and the victimhood go all the way back to the original Zoroastrian text? And it seems like yes, they do, with this distinction between Asha and Druj. Like the natural question that comes up for me here is when it relates to the origin of philosophy and perhaps the origin of civilization, or at least a deeper understanding of what civilization is. Do you think civilization could really function without understanding this dimension between heroicism and victimhood cults? Like, do you think that this is a necessary sort of evolutionary adaptation in our thinking, or anything along these lines?
No, I don't think there is an evolution. I don't think there is a progress of any kind. What Zoroaster deals with specifically, 1700 before Christ, is the possibility of creating some kind of organization for a population that's larger than tribe. Zoroaster's just discovered that after experimenting with semi-nomadic culture and being nomadic prior to that, human beings were ready to settle permanently. And of course, this was a byproduct of written language. And Zoroaster is very well aware that with written language arrives information accumulation on a scale we never had before, meaning we can, for example, leave something behind when we die, which is called the text. We can also leave behind our life experiences after we die as experience and pass them on through text, meaning something can transcend us. And he's seriously interested in this. The difference between Haurvatat and Ameritat is the Haurvatat is to live a full and whole life. Ameritat is that which transcends you. And these are two totally different things with Zoroaster, meaning that you can leave something behind after you die that other people can find useful, so they don't have to repeat your mistakes. And this is, of course, where ethics starts, because if they don't have to repeat your mistakes, you've also acknowledged that if you make a mistake, get up again and try again. And this comes as a reward for having a constructive mindset. The constructive mindset doesn't require that you are successful in any whatsoever. It just requires you to get up on your feet and try again for as long as you can, until you pass on your knowledge to the next generation, who can then build from what you just learned. And Zoroaster is incredibly interested in Gothas in this shift from the semi-nomadic to permanent settlement. Now, the problem for Nietzsche in the mid-1800s is that the Zend Avesta has arrived in Europe, and it's high fashion to read it. And he was obviously learned both in Avesta and Sanskrit, as was Hegel. But the problem was you hadn't really sorted out what was Zoroaster's text in the Zend Avesta, and rather what part of the text had the authors. Eventually, by the 1870s, German scholars have sorted out there's an original text here called the Gathas. Eventually, it's the Iranian equivalent to the Bhagavad Gita in Hinduism, and that's, of course, Zoroaster's own words. So whoever was Zoroaster is also the author of the Gathas. It's only after Nietzsche we really see the full pattern. So the way I would argue is that there is more Zoroastrianism in Also sprach Zarathustra than Nietzsche actually understands. But he works on intuition, and he's working on intuition that he acknowledges that this is a character he can build on. And that's why he picks Zoroaster rather than Moses or Christ as a central figure of this text.
All right. I think you've already mentioned that there is also a link between Zoroastrianism, Nietzsche, and Spinoza. I think it might be also interesting to bring in Spinoza's link to Nietzsche a little bit, because of the many philosophers that Nietzsche affirms in his own sort of writing, others being Diogenes, as you already mentioned, Heraclitus, Zoroaster, Schopenhauer, Spinoza comes up as a sort of figure of metaphysical significance in Nietzsche. And I would be interested in, how do you make sense of the distinction that Spinoza brings into the picture, and how do you think Nietzsche is interpreting Spinoza?
Okay, so the trait from Heraclitus onto Nietzsche was almost there already in Nietzsche's mindset. Heraclitus was obviously trained among the Persians, and he was a court philosopher in the Median Empire and things like that. And the reason why we find fragments of Heraclitus in Greece might be the fact that he wasn't even there. We don't really know historically, but with Heraclitus and even Pythagoras, there's the connection, right? With Spinoza, it's indirect. So what Spinoza contributes to Western philosophy is the arrival of radical monism. There's just one world. And if God exists, then the world and God are one and the same thing. And why would God create anything but himself? This radical monist take is deeply Jewish in a way, and Spinoza was a Jew, but that's not where Spinoza gets it from. He clearly gets it from monist Sufis. And the Sufis were all over the Iberian Peninsula at the time. And Spinoza's origin is Portuguese. I would say it's Portuguese Sufi, like think Moroccan Sufi but Portuguese. That's clearly where Spinoza gets his really wild and strange ideas from. And then he arrives in Holland. His family comes to the Netherlands, and there's, of course, he's excommunicated from the Jewish congregation, which by then is far too Christian in its mindset to be properly Jewish. They're no longer Sadducites. So the monist element is so radical that in Europe, everybody thinks that nobody's thought of the world as being monist before Spinoza arrives, when in reality, the entire Eastern world has always been monist, primarily monist, right? So Zoroaster is a monist. We have to remember that Zoroaster is a monist, and that's why there's a radical break between Zoroastrianism on the one hand and eventually Islam and Christianity on the other hand that are dualist religions. The Zoroastrians, the last thing they do when they run the Sassanid Empire in the 5th and 6th century is they go after the Gnostics big time. They go after Mostok, Mani, the other guys big time. The last thing the Zoroastrians try to do as they run the Persian Empire is basically to close the loophole historically for dualism to explode. They couldn't stop it though. And eventually Christianity in the West and Islam in the Middle East conquer the world and become these sort of pop religions, these sort of pop deviations of Judaism and Zoroastrianism that we're stuck with ever since. And of course, they flatter us with their dualism. So the way you do religion and sell it to the masses is that you either take the Hinduist pagan approach, which you say that, well, everything reincarnates. So since death is so fiendishly hard to deal with, you say, well, there's no death. You survive, you just come back in another form, in another life form. That's reincarnation. The other, even cheaper alternative is to say that, no, when you die, just go somewhere else. And you put that somewhere else, somewhere out there in heaven, or if you want to threaten somebody, you also create a hell. Of course, Christianity and Islam do exactly this. And we all know that there's no reincarnation. And we all know there's no afterlife. And that's why I'm saying Christianity and Islam, to me, philosophically speaking, are dead and over. We can't do it any longer. Nietzsche made it obvious to us as Westerners Christianity was dead. The death of God has much more meaning than that, but Christianity was definitely out of the picture by the time we arrived at Nietzsche. I think even Hegel had killed it before that. But the revolution against Christianity really starts with the arrival of Western monism, and that's Spinoza. Spinoza is the first guy, takes up the hammer and puts the nail in there. Hegel booms it in, and the last little knock needed was done by Nietzsche. So if you look at the pattern from Spinoza through Hegel onto Nietzsche, these are the three guys that killed Christianity in the West.
Right on. That's really helpful. And for those doing research in sort of the direction that Bard's suggesting there's definitely a way in which you have to understand at least the basics of Spinoza in order to understand what Hegel's really trying to get at with the science of logic. And then I think that with that foundation, it gives you sort of a really deep sort of background to then dive into Nietzsche's work.
Exactly. You should say both Spinoza, Hegel, and Nietzsche are monists. Mm-hmm. They don't believe in any second substance. They can all ask the question. You should all ask Descartes or a Christian for that matter, which is, if there are two different substances, then how do they communicate with one another? Oh, a third substance is required. Model over, dead, right? So if there's only one world that we know of, and everything is interconnected within this world, and it runs along a time axis, then the three thinkers who really make that explicit in Western thinking are Spinoza, Hegel, and Nietzsche. And Christianity cannot survive that. There's no possibility for Christian monism, because then Christ cannot have died on the cross to be resurrected 3 days later. Everything about Christianity dies the second you accept there's only one substance. That's exactly why Christians and Jews alike hated Spinoza. And Hegel and Nietzsche were adamant that Spinoza was the messiah of philosophy. They were adamant about that. He's the precursor. He walked ahead of us to open up the door with Hegel can then dialecticize this one world and this one substance, which is what Hegel does beautifully. And then Nietzsche starts applying that thinking onto the world, looking at what happens to narrative in that case, what happens to the way we tell stories about ourselves, being human, all too human. That is Nietzsche's great enterprise.
I think that's a great window to talk about some key Nietzschean concepts that it would be interesting to get the Bardian view on them. The first one, I think, I mean, some of them have already been mentioned. I think when you're talking about dualism and two substances, we can get into that again as it relates to sort of the master-slave morality. But let's start with perspectivism, I think, because you're sort of saying in this larger metaphysical project from Spinoza to Hegel to Nietzsche that once we get to Nietzsche and beyond sort of Hegel's dialectic, Nietzsche is playing around with narrative. And I think that might be an interesting way to link in Nietzsche's view on perspectivism. What would be your take?
Well, I never used the term perspectivism on Nietzsche, so maybe I can offer some friendly disagreement.
Sure.
Just to sharpen the discussion a bit. I dislike the term immensely. I don't think it applies on Nietzsche. And what I mean with that is that I use the term paradigmatics, radically so. Jan Söderqvist and I have written about paradigmatics for several years. So what we mean with that is that there's a certain paradigm involved in value creation. That paradigm is the material conditions around you, including other human beings and their bodies. Say, for example, if you live in a mountainous area, you will have a different worldview than if you live in a river valley, or if you live in a desert or on a plain or some kind. Yeah, depending on where you live, is it cold or is it hot? Things like that. Is the area densely populated, or are the neighbors far in between? Those things affect how you think. So paradigmatics allows for certain values to be timeless. And with human beings, say have a time frame for a few million years at most, and maybe 40,000 years more specifically, because Homo sapiens expanded across the globe over the last 40,000 years and killed everything it found in its way and therefore conquered the world. So if you think of Homo sapiens over the last 40,000 years, we haven't changed. If anything, we become more stupid and our brains are smaller than they were 30,000 years ago. But so we're around. But if you think of what's timeless for us as Homo sapiens, we discover that family comes back in every culture we ever studied. There's a concept of family. It's usually larger than the sort of stupid nuclear families we have today that are not very sustainable simply because they're too small. But family is a concept we have. Clan is another concept we have. The Dunbar number is clan size. It's about 157 people. And the way we relate to them, we can also relate to about 1,200, 1,500 people, remember their faces and their names, and emotionally relate to them in the way that we could even be willing to die for them, and that's tribe. Now, beyond tribe, we're not born to really pay attention to anything beyond tribe, because we didn't need to care about tribe until very recently. No, but anything that is tribal or smaller are values we could credit as being timeless for us as humans. That means the values that then change over time. When Nietzsche is obsessed with, he's a bit of a drama queen, like he's standing on the Alps, and is looking out and he says, I want to be this character who creates brand new values for a new era. Yeah, you can only create certain brand new values for a new era because there has to be a new historical era to begin with. And here I'm being a bit of a Marxist. I'll say, unless there are specifically new material conditions where you live, you cannot really create new values that will last, because they won't fly. Nobody will pay attention to you. You just seem mad. But if you do create the right new values at the right time, not only will those values fly and you'll be popular because of it, you'll probably be the priest of the new paradigm to begin with, or the prophet at least, but certainly also you will then create a new master class of that specific paradigm because you've figured out how things will work. So the way to do Nietzsche today for me, and what I did with Jan Söderqvist, is that I started looking at digital as if digital was a whole new paradigm historically. And when other guys were obsessed with agriculture as being a major revolution, I never really cared too much about agriculture. I agree with historians today who says that agriculture developed back and forth over 30,000 years. There never was a revolution to begin with, and many cultures did fine without it. Okay? No, but written language. Spoken language separates human beings from apes, then written language separates civilized human beings from non-civilized or pre-civilized human beings. So the prehistoric and the historic, differentiated between written language. Without written language, you can't even write history. You can't even have a written narrative that survives you. And this is Zoroaster's great insight in the Gathas, is to understand the radicality of being able to pass information on to the next generation beyond your own death, which had been physically impossible before written language existed. And then, of course, you could create states and bureaucracies and all kinds of larger structures than tribe because of that. And that's what Zoroaster problematized and encouraged. So he was the first civilizationist. Okay? The written language, after that comes printed language. Obviously, modernity as we know it, the European Enlightenment, is based on written language and printed language. It could have happened in China, but because of the Mongol invasion, the Chinese Revolution was stopped and the Mongols took over the world. They couldn't care less about written language. They cared about mathematics, but they didn't care too much about written language. After that, Europe was lucky enough to get the second chance that China had, and in Europe, being as isolated as it was, that revolution succeeded. Europe conquered 3 further continents, and half the world became European, and we're now living sort of in the waves after that revolution. But anyway, if you look at it that way, digital really should be a revolution of the same magnitude as the previous 3 ones. If those are the only revolutions that exist, they're all material and they're all information technological. And the only thing that really matters when we look back at history today and try to make sense of it and try to turn it into Hegelian necessity, these revolutions are the only thing that matter.
Right.
If that is the case, that means the entire power structure we built during the capitalist industrialist era will now fall apart and will need to be replaced. Nietzsche would have applauded this. Nietzsche would have seen this as the great chance to be a proper Nietzschean. Elon Musk is a Nietzschean. Let's look at it that way. But we need more Nietzscheans than Elon Musk. We need other forms of Nietzscheans. And we call this new elite the Netocrats. And the whole concept of a netocracy is precisely where we mix Marx and Nietzsche in our work, Jan and I.
Right. I mean, I think that sort of example of paradigmatics is extraordinarily useful. It's something that comes up in my work as well. Again, this distinction as it relates to emergent information mediums like language connected to the first humans, written language connected to history, print connected to modernity, and now digital throwing us into this new world where we're going to need people who, like you're naming Elon Musk, basically people who are breaking the tables and potentially creating the new tables, to use the Nietzschean language. And I think that brings us to the concept of the Overman. What do you see as the utility of the Overman in the context of digital? I think that would be a perfect way to think about Nietzsche in the future.
Well, the failure of the Overman is because Nietzsche is part of the European individualist tradition. And individualism is a really weird idea. But it occurs in Europe in the 17th century, and it spreads as a paradigmatic idea, simply because a lot of people were sitting on their own reading books. Now, it's a very isolated experience to read an affordable printed book. And once you read the Bible and you're tired of it, you realize you can write other books in the Bible that are better than the Bible. And that's essentially what the European Enlightenment was. But I think it also fostered the idea, Immanuel Kant is the peak of this idea, that if you sit there and read the book on your own and you're thinking, you're having a dialogue to yourself, then that must be, the most important thing in the world. When in reality, when we think, our concentration capacity is incredibly limited. Whereas if we have a dialogue with one another, like you and I right now, we can keep the same thing in the air for hours. No, humans are deeply social beings, right? They're not individuals. So I think Nietzsche both attempts at taking the idea of the content individual to its very extreme with Overman. But the Overman is also incredibly interesting, but then it should be read in parallel with Marx's concept of the proletariat. Like one of my friends said once when he was sitting high on drugs next to me, he said that, why doesn't Nietzsche have a best buddy? Well, it turned out that he wasn't very good at making best buddies, did he? No, he had a sister instead who haunted him his entire life. And that was probably the worst thing that happened to him. But because she was mediocre, she wasn't brilliant. But why didn't Nietzsche have a best buddy is a really deeply human question to ask yourself when you study Nietzsche as a person. Because at least there should be 2. Alenka Supanchis, of course, being a female philosopher, and Nietzsche has pointed this out. She even wrote a book about Nietzsche saying that at the end of the day, Nietzsche really is the philosopher of there's never less than 2. And it's personal because the Overman cannot be Overman on his own. So I think, though, if you take the Overman as an ideal, say he's a specific archetype within a tribe that becomes a new elite or establish a new master class of a new paradigm, it makes perfect sense. Because what's lacking in Marx's understanding of the proletariat is that the proletariat isn't shifted. The proletariat isn't split into different archetypes that are brilliant to different things. But if you merge Marx and Nietzsche today, you can do wonderful work. We did it with the Netocrats. It is a Marxist Nietzschean book. We throw Marx against Nietzsche, And what happens is that we can both take the concept of the overman, but turn the overman into a collective, I would say today, a gated community that starts practicing the new values properly using all the new technologies available to then become the master race of a new society that then other people at best can mimic. And that's how you establish a new paradigm in history. So we can't really talk about the death of God credibly, because once we kill a certain God, we create new gods. Religion never disappears. Richard Dawkins, sorry, but Richard Dawkins tried to fill his own ego with God, didn't work very well. We were not impressed. There will always be gods around, because God is just a name for where we come from or where we're going, if nothing else. So if gods are always around and we create gods all the time and we accepted that, then the question is, how do you kill a paradigm? And how do you embrace and walk into a new paradigm? And what is required to walk into the new paradigm? And then it turns out, this is deeply Nietzschean, that if you're fat and lazy and decadent because you were the winner of the previous paradigm, you're the most unlikely person in the world to be the overman. The overman is never the son of the previous overman. Never. Why? Because the curse of being successful is to breed fat and lazy and arrogant kids. But whoever gets access to the new technology, whoever gets access to the new way of using language and communication, whoever gets access to the new accumulated information and can start processing it, and is hungry and wants to get ahead, will be successful and will establish themselves as the lords of the new paradigm.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I see like a natural gateway there, specifically in the way you're connecting Marx and Nietzsche into creating this idea of the Netocrats, to think about the will to power, perhaps also in a more tribo-poetic way or in a more social way.
Well, I can say that the word I want to drop here is the word exodology. So when I say that we should read Karl Marx today as a Jew and then read Nietzsche as a German, the way we read Freud and Jung next to each other very creatively, I would say that to read Marx as a Jew is to read Marx as a guy who wants to collect the hungry guys, the slaves of the old paradigm, who understand they can become masters of the new paradigm. When they hear about the new paradigm, which is, of course, called the Promised Land in Judaism, they leave Egypt and walk to the Promised Land. And basically, Moses is just asking them, who wants to come with me? If you want to stay in Egypt, you can stay in Egypt and be whatever Egypt is going to be, because it's just going to be fat, lazy, arrogant, and dead. But you can stay there if you like. But you're willing to come if you want to. You can come with me. And we call this exodology. And that's what's lacking in Nietzsche. That's what we need to read Marx next to Nietzsche, because what's lacking in Nietzsche is a story of how you leave the old and walk into the new as a group. Because he's so focused on taking Kantian individualism to its very extreme. He does that brilliantly. But with Nietzsche also, and with his madness, with the end of Nietzsche, we reach a certain point where actually individualism dies with Nietzsche. He's the end of that experiment. And once we've done that, we can start looking at phenomena like will to power, because then we discover the will to power is another unfinished, great, but unfinished idea in Nietzsche.
Well, in Thus I'd be interested to get your view, because in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he does have quite a few meditations on, for example, the distinction between the neighbor and the friend, and he does talk about, for example, how on this path of overcoming and on the pathway towards the Overman, that one does need companions on the way. So. Do you think that
you're onto something great here? We should remind about it. There is a timeless way of reading Nietzsche and the Overman if you want to, and that's reading Nietzsche as a philosopher of the shamanic. So, okay, so the way tribal mapping works, and this is very Marxist, like contemporary Marxist, that you have an inner realm, which is a matriarchy controlled by women. You have an outer realm, which is a patriarchy controlled by men. And then you have an androgynous zone in between the two, what we usually call LGBT people these days. Other people who walk in between the two genders, between the two realms within the tribe. Then you also have shamanic characters, and data anthropology, which opens fantastic doors these days, proves that about 4% of all people are shamanoid characters. So they're not comfortable living the way other people live. They're not even comfortable in the LGBT community. They're not comfortable anywhere within tribe. They want to be outside tribe, and they want to find those who are like them outside the tribe. And they specifically leave and walk out into the wilderness, and they do not die when they meet a stranger. They can have peaceful relations with strangers. And precisely because the shamanic character can have peaceful relations with strangers without getting killed, they are credited within the tribe, no matter how crazy they're considered. They're credited with the monopoly of having all peaceful relations with the outside world, meaning they get to talk to the gods and the demons as much as they get to talk to the strangers, and they get to talk to the forefathers. They might even get to talk to children of the future, but they get to talk to anybody who's outside the tribe. That's their monopoly. And when that's required, they're called in. In Judaism, this is, of course, Joseph, who's hired by the Pharaoh to go to the court. He's being spit at 6 years out of 7. But the 7th year, when the Egyptians don't have an answer to what's going on, Joseph is being asked for the answer. The typical way you treat a shaman is that you treat him as a scapegoat 6 years out of 7 and spit at him. The 7th year, he's absolutely required. Your entire survival is dependent on it. And these shamanic characters, Nietzsche takes to them very seriously because he's obviously a shamanoid personality himself. This is also why it's so hard to nail Nietzsche sexually. I would say that for people who speculate on Nietzsche, the most popular idea these days that he was gay or something, I'd say, no, I think they're all wrong, because I think Nietzsche sexually is in a realm of 3 or 4 people involved in his sexual fantasy, or else there's no sexual fantasy at all. That's why he fell in love with Lo Salome and asked her to marry him 3 times. Lo Salome was this beautiful, socially successful woman who was a known ascetic and refused to have sex. She was the perfect wife for Nietzsche. Not that he was an ascetic, but it's just the perfect blend for somebody to marry with if your sex life basically happens in whorehouses or whatever, but you cannot really imagine it with less than 3 or 4 people involved. And this idea that ritual is more primary to you than having sex with somebody you're in love with is deeply shamanoid. Deeply shaman. Masters and Johnson discovered this in sexology in the 1970s. They said there are 4 different ways of looking at sexual orientation. There is the heterosexual, the homosexual, the bisexual, and the just sexual. And those who are just sexual, they don't see any limitations at all. And they're what we call shamanoid personalities today. I think that's where Nietzsche fits in. And this is why we can read Nietzsche. If we read the Overman in a more timeless manner, which we're allowed to do, I would say he's a great defender of the shamanoid character. And that's also why we take so much inspiration from Nietzsche when we see him as, say, the son of Goethe, rather than as, somebody opposed to Kant. And if you look at Nietzsche as a writer, and as a writer who comes after Goethe, then certainly this writer who celebrates the shamanic is timeless aspect of the Overman.
All right. Could you situate this shamanoid character within sort of the connection I want to try and get at here is that I think that you're making an interesting point when you say that Nietzsche is taking Kantian individualism and pushing it to its extreme, and that the Overman can be represented as this individualistic type of entity, but that we need to, what I'm getting from what you're saying is we need to tribalize Nietzsche. We need to situate Nietzsche within a higher order social network phenomenon, a netocratic phenomenon. And how is the will to power, in your view, interpreted in this frame? Is it connected to the shamanistic type of psyche, which is capable of sort of going in between limits and in between boundaries that other people might be unable to cross, let's say? What's your view on this?
Let's put it this way. If both Adolf Hitler and Ayn Rand were very, wrong about Nietzsche, they're like the 2 forms of vulgar Nietzscheanism are Hitler and Rand. I would say the real inheritor of Nietzsche's fantasy of the Overman in the 20th century is the rock star. There's much more Jimi Hendrix to Nietzsche's idea of the Overman here than there is to anything else. The problem with that is that when we put the shaman on the stage as an ideal, is that the shaman should only be ideal for the next generation of shamans. It's a bit like a gay guy could be a good role model for the next generation of gay guys, but we shouldn't force straight guys to be like the gay guy, because it's just deeply unfair. We just put the guys in the wrong place. And I think this is where we don't have a clear map from Nietzsche, in the sense that Nietzsche celebrates something that he celebrates publicly, but it's really very specialized. And that's where the Overman can actually make sense in a more timeless manner, because otherwise we have to read the Overman. If the Overman is a social ideal for Nietzsche, for everybody in the community, then that is an Overman that is just a parody of the Kantian individual. And there's nothing for us to find there. There's nothing to find. If we read Also Sprach Zarathustra today, I think it's primarily text to be read by young artists to get inspiration to create great art. And that's why I say read Goethe next to Nietzsche and then read Also Sprach Zarathustra. If you're going to use that specific book intensely, it makes perfect sense to do that. Our friend Owen Cox is a perfect Nietzschean in that sense. But if you look at Will to Power, yes, Will to Power would make sense for a shaman. He's just heading out there into the wilderness on the pursuit towards truth, no matter what, taking 15 tons of drugs or whatever on his way to go into mad hell and then maybe come back with something that could be useful for the tribe or maybe not. Or maybe something that could be useful for the shaman, but he should keep his mouth shut about, right? So, but if we take Will to Power now historically and try to use it in social theory, we have to split it. And the reason we have to split it is because even within Nietzsche himself, and certainly within Hegel, that split already is there, but it was never established by Nietzsche because, as we all know, Nietzsche never wrote Wille zur Macht. But what he would have had to do is he would have had to divide Will to Power into the will to knowledge, or the will to intelligence, is what Heraclitus and I call it, all the way up to now, and after that, the will to transcendence. This again is Zoroastrianism's Harvatat versus Ameritat. So there's some of us wake up in the morning and want to have a cup of coffee and then go off and find out everything about the world, and we cannot just stop learning and loving to learn. That eagerness, which is the monk character among men, is the will to intelligence. That's the priest character among leaders. The other character is the guy who's going to lead you into the future, no matter what, whatever happens. And he's on fire about leading into the future, into the contingent future, taking huge risks, but also establishing ourselves through our freedom, therefore co-creating the future that to future generations will then look necessary. This is where Hegel and Nietzsche completely agree. And that's why both if you read Hegel next to Nietzsche and then you go back and read Nietzsche, okay, the unfinished part of Wille zur Macht is the Wille zur Macht, at least applied to us humans, means that there must both be a will to intelligence and there must be a will to transcendence. Then there's also a third will that completes the triad among human beings, and that's the willingness to follow. And the willingness to follow, of course, lies on women and children, who then, because they do follow the fellows, are willing to give birth to the next generation and raise it, which is your true transcendence. Because if you don't have children, then who's going to be around to enjoy whatever fruits come out of your labor? And I think this is this sort of nomadological view of what Nietzsche is doing, is that will to power is an excellent concept, but we can't take it seriously as one will to power. And that was always his problem. It has to be split into a will to intelligence and a will to transcendence, and two very different wills that should be assigned to different archetypes. And this is the problem, will to power, being kept monolithically as one concept. It can only foster a tyrant. And without blaming Hitler on Nietzsche, which we should never do, just like we shouldn't blame Stalin on Marx. But when we look at it now historically, is that if we split the will to power into will to intelligence, which is the priest, and will to transcendence, which is the chief, it becomes impossible to allow a tyrant to be will to power.
Take a drink if you need there. So it's interesting what you're saying about the split in the will to power. I'd be interested actually to put your distinction into some sort of engagement with the way I sort of read Nietzsche's will to power in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That is sort of, he gives the idea that the will to power is singular in itself. You might even say a monist metaphysics. He does say that it becomes split in regards to a sort of low-level egoic representations of master and slave, or commander and followers, or some sort of way in which this could be situated in, let's say, like a master-slave dialectic of some kind. But he gives the idea that for the person who's committed to self-overcoming, this master-slave dialectic is ultimately internalized.
He's mistaking two things, and that's very important. He's mistaking two things that we can then later go into the Dionysian, which is the problem of the Dionysian, which also must be split. Okay, he's mistaking master and slave, which is one axis, those who lead and those who follow. And there's no problem with following, because usually following is women who give birth to children or something like that, incredibly responsible. And by the way, the followers, this is Foucault. Foucault is great to read next to Nietzsche, because Foucault is probably the greatest Nietzschean of the 20th century. In the sense that Foucault did Nietzsche's project all over again, but upside down. He took the slave's perspective onto the master. The slave ultimately is the delivery station to the master, in the sense that woman is the delivery station to man. That means master-slave is just one axis here that must be separated from the Ashandruj axis, which is heroic and victimhood. There is no victimhood in following. Absolutely none. And this is not clear in Nietzsche. He never makes that clear distinction between the two. These are two different things we must learn to separate. So the master-slave is basically just who leads and who follows. If the whole tribe is going to move forward and survive until the next day, the slaves need to follow the master. Okay, it's just a question of leadership. The other question is that, are you heroic or are you in the victimhood mode? And the most terrible thing you could then imagine, of course, is that the followers try to stay heroic, but the leaders have gone into victimhood mode. And then you get, for example, woke culture today, which is incredibly dangerous historically. But by splitting the two and not allowing them to interfere with one another, it becomes a lot easier to see where the values are at. And this is what's lacking in Nietzsche's division between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The problem with the Dionysian, which René Girard has pointed out, and I'm sure Thomas Hammerich has gone through this with you previously in previous sessions, is that the Dionysian must be split because the Dionysian, being the force of change that it is at all times, it's just that when things get too stale and too ordered, then the Dionysian comes back to haunt us. And if that is the case, the Dionysian can either be, constructively revolutionary, or it can just be completely destructive and apocalyptic. In the former case, we still should call it Dionysian. I use the term Dionysian swarm for that, to stay with Nietzsche's spirit here. But I think there's also a Sibyllian mob. The Sibyllian, which many post-Nietzscheans have discussed, but Nietzsche does not discuss, the Sibyllian is the mob that are embittered and resentful. And they get the name from the Greek goddess Cybele. Cybele was known to fall in love with her own son. Because she could not have incest with her own son, the gods castrated her son. Therefore, Cybele is a bitter bitch running around the world constantly, followed by a whole bunch of eunuchs, equally bitter eunuchs. These are people who are deprived of their own sexuality completely. And therefore, they're against all forms of sexuality. We clearly see the signs of that in woke culture today. So the Sibyllian mob is the destructive, the druj, or the victimhood cult in Nietzsche, taken into a collective. Whereas what Nietzsche celebrates, the heroic swarm that brings on the new and throws out the old and kills the old patriarch. When the patriarch is sleeping with his own son's wives, it's time to let him go and kill him. And the death of the patriarch is the revolution in a Nietzschean sense. And that's the Dionysian. The Dionysian swarm, if you allow for the separate Nietzsche, is of course identical to Marx's dream about the proletariat. And this is why it's so necessary for us to separate the Dionysian and the Sibyllian to understand the ethical implications of crowds. And this is precisely why the 20th century was full of these Canetti, Girard, all these writers, anthropologists especially, who were looking at crowds. When do crowds go absolutely bonkers? And when are crowds really meaningful? When are crowds actually a voice from the future runs through the streets and throws out the old and opens the possibility for the new? And this is not something that Nietzsche has defined in his work, but I think we can help him out again by finishing his project. And I think the Dionysian swarm versus Sibyllian mob is a great way of doing that. And then we can go back to Marx. And then, of course, Marx has defined that there's a proletariat, they're heroic, and there's a lumpen proletariat of which Marx thinks nothing. May they die in hell or whatever, because they are the victimhood cult. They're the Rousseauians that Marx even sees in the streets of London. And therefore, Marx and Nietzsche are identical.
I'd be interested, could you give some historical examples from our recent times, maybe the 21st century, of a Sibyllian mob and a Dionysian swarm? Like I'm thinking here, like woke phenomenon, or like, for example, the Arab Spring. How would you categorize these types of phenomena?
Well, you can only see the necessity in hindsight, right? We've learned that from Hegel, and that's amor fati in Nietzsche too. I would be careful to jump to conclusions too early because there's so many different motives involved, and even your own shadow, the darkest parts of you, can actually create something really wonderful for humanity, sometimes just by luck and coincidence. But I would say when it comes to the thought patterns we're looking at, my friend Rick Falkfinger started the Pirate Party in Sweden, the first pirate party a few years after the Netocrats came out. And he spoke about the swarm versus the mob already then. Now, the Pirate Party were naive, and eventually they sort of went down. They're still around in a few countries in Europe. But there was a certain Dionysian swarm mentality to it because they were the first group of people who said that the internet has fantastic potential. It can also go dead wrong, but it has fantastic potential. If we design it properly from the very beginning, it can actually do a lot of good for humanity. That's still today, for example, the discussions about AI. AI is not here yet, but once AI comes along, AI will probably design itself. So, what kind of program do we give to AI before it starts kicking in? This is what philosophers like me are obsessed with these days. If we still have the time to influence the AI, what kind of things would we tell the AI that we would ask it to do, including like leaving us alive or something like that? But the Dionysian swarm has this, it is for me a meditative, contemplative mindset. It's something you can afford to do in the morning. You get up, and even if your life is tough like hell, there's no payback to being bitter against life. It's only comfortable briefly. Therefore, it's associated with short term thinking. But long term thinking, you are your own enemy when you go into the victimhood mode, when you dig into the druge. But it can be very comforting to become bitter, because if you're bitter, you also allow yourself to become lazy. You allow yourself, as Freud would say, to live life without life. So libido is the word for being heroic, and mortido, which is death drive in its pure form, is really the word for cherishing the victimhood cult. Now, the mortido is always the motor of both, but either you stay with the mortido, and the only way to stay mortido is to live a life as if you would like to kill yourself, but you're even too lazy to kill yourself. That is what Slavoj Žižek talks about as being a zombie, or being, somebody who's alive but not alive. You're a living dead, basically. John Farvarkis talked about it extensively too, and that's mortido, and that is the victimhood mindset. So I'd like to, when we look at this collectively, for example, when we start studying different cultures, we have to look at, does this culture really benefit its own children? Does this culture foster its own children to achieve things in life and be successful, and be free, and things like that? Or is this a culture that really fosters the children to just become beggars and feel sorry for themselves, and is cherishing a culture of resentment? And we should allow ourselves to study different cultures in this way, because we have to. For example, all the sects and cults that thrive on the internet today, we have to study them. Is this ultimately, what is the end game here? And if the end game is everybody should go down, including myself, then that's just pure resentful narcissism and nothing else. And the whole culture can be full of that. And I think this is where it's important for us, when we look at things ethically today, to be able to discuss the Dionysian swarm versus the Sibelian mob. And we don't find that in Nietzsche, but we find the door to open the door. The key is in Nietzsche to go into that realm and start studying the Dionysian, which Christianity covered over, but Nietzsche brought up again.
Well, that's not in Nietzsche, but a key that I think is in Nietzsche, and I think which is both implicit and explicit in what you're saying, is the way in which the master-slave morality functions on the level of metaphysics. So Nietzsche was criticizing master-slave morality as it related to Christianity. And as you already mentioned, the dual world mythology, where you have two substances. You have the substance of this world, and you have the substance of some heavenly other world, where you're going to get the body you like, and you're going to get to have the enjoyment that you can't have in this world. And Nietzsche thought this was born of resentment. How do you think the sort of phenomena you've been talking about are new manifestations of the master-slave morality, and how do you think we should interpret it in the 21st century?
Oh, we've just replaced the church with the state. That's what's happening in Western culture today. So what people are doing with the church is no longer around, is that they want to force the wealthy, the heroic who are successful out there, the people they envy, to pay more tax and have that taxation thrown into a big pile and then call it the state. And then people want to turn the state into a big tit, a mamilla, and suck the tit and stay infantile forever. Now, Marx would have hated it. He would have loathed what the left is today. I think the last remnants of Karl Marx were cleansed out in the 1970s, and it left with the working class when they left the left. And what was left with the left was middle-class academics who were total Rousseauians. Starts with hegemony, a socialist strategy by Leclos and Chantal Mouffe, who proudly declare that they hate Marx because Marxist workers didn't do the revolution they found so sexy, and therefore the middle class has to take over, and therefore the state has to grow bigger, and the state has to make everybody dependent on it. And that's essentially where we end up. We end up with a pathetic left where nobody is heroic any longer. Nobody believes in their own entrepreneurship. Nobody believes in their own capacity to innovate. All they believe in is that I'm going to go out in the street and become a beggar and scream at the top of my lungs that, put more taxes on the rich and put those taxes into the state coffers. And then I'm going to milk the state coffers the rest of my life until I die. I think it is degrading to have that kind of worldview. And that's why I'm a Marxist, Marxist Nietzschean or Marxist libertarian, whatever we call it. But I'm certainly Marxist, lower taxes, smaller state, get rid of it, like the original Marxists were. They would have hated the state to be this big. They would have said it like, it's just like you accumulate a huge mamilla. So instead of becoming phallic, when you're 1 year of age, you should get away from the mill and start hating your mother's tit. And you should walk towards the phallus to eventually one day rebel against the phallus to become phallic on your own. Man or woman doesn't matter. That's being a grown-up. And that whole process that John Söderqvist and I have written about is what needs to be reformed. It needs to be brought back into culture, because otherwise the state dependence is even worse than the church dependency ever was. We become eternal children. And this is what Nietzsche attacks in Christianity. He attacks the very idea that we're children of God. Now, a Nietzschean religion is a religion of the adults of God who co-create the world with God, which happens to be Zoroastrianism. It also happens to be Judaism if you read Karl Marx properly. And that's why, to me, when I say that Zoroastrianism and Judaism are the two adult religions of the West, and the cradle of the West is Persian Hebrew, and Islam and Christianity are only vulgar pop versions that became popular because they cheaply borrowed feudal structures that you could have an afterlife, meaning you can milk people to death and exploit them as much as you like, as long as you take them to church on a Sunday, promise they go to heaven when they die. And if you make them believe that, fine, you can exploit them as much as you like. That's feudal tyranny, right? Feudal tyranny, Islam and Christianity were perfect for it. And that's why Islam and Christianity is still around, because industrial society mimicked feudal society so much, until we're now getting to the point we're walking into the internet age, where I think Christianity and Islam are completely unattainable. They're no longer credible in a way. That's why they go into these fundamentalist outbursts. That's why Christians and Muslims, the few that are left, are going absolutely fundamentalist and blow up children and blow up bombs and all kinds of things. They might even have their Armageddon if they really want it. We might have an Armageddon. We might have a war between the Christians and Muslims. They're desiring it so deeply. But I'm not going to be part of it. I'm certainly going to stay out of it. And I'm a Zoroastrian. And I think as a Westerner, you either have to go with Zoroastrianism or become a Nietzschean, or you have to go with the Jews and become a Marxist today and realize that going back to the tribe and making the tribe work is a timeless value. But the other aspect of the time-specific value is to understand the internet and then use the internet as much as you possibly can to create as many Dionysian swarms you can to go up against the Siberian mobs.
It's interesting, sort of the way in which you're framing the state as this big tit or a motherly a figure that is going to keep us in a mode of being eternal children. This is definitely a theme that comes up in Nietzsche. The problems involved in adultification, as you've there's a great talk actually that you had at a I think it was a previous European men's gathering about the adultification of society and the need to walk away from the tit and this model of the mother and the father. What do you see the father in this role as some, or the phallus? If the state is the tit, is the phallus sort of creating your own online force? Is it adapting to or innovating within techno-capitalism or attentionalism? How do you imagine the phallic force as it relates to the comparison with the motherly state?
Well, you and I work a lot with triads, right? Because triads are stable and dialectic starts with triads. So you should always think about a stable power structure over time will become a triad. It become a triad for the very simple reason, Shaka Khan is correct here, that the three ways for us as to encounter the world. We do it in the real, we do it symbolically, and we do it in the imaginary. So the equivalent of that, and we've been working a lot on this for the past 25 years. When I say that we prophesized and say that guys like Elon Musk would be around, we did so 30 years ago. We called these guys like Elon Musk, we call them informationalists. And the informationalists in our work are the first of three types of netocrats. They're phallic because they're entrepreneurial. They realize the enormous potential in new technology. They believe that technology can change the world, for better or worse, then if it's at least conscious, then certainly for the better. Problems like climate change can be solved. Hopefully, we can lock up the atomic bombs, use atomic energy peacefully, etc., etc. Right? So we call them big tech today, but we could also call them, say, tech optimists or techno-capitalists, or whatever you want to call them. They're riding on capitalism, but they also know that beyond capitalism, there will be another way relating to human beings called attentionalism, meaning that capitalism, as we know, will die one day, and attentionalism will take over. And another word for attentionalism is algorithms. And if you tie blockchains to algorithms, you basically got the entire coin you need to kill capitalism. But instead of going into the details, they're the first netocracy. The second netocracy is much more problematic, and that's what we call the sensocracy. And the only guys who figure this out already and have a real fantasy of what the sensocracy is going to look like are the Chinese. They really want to have a police state with a Stalin dictator at the top. They really do. That is Chinese communism. They think anything else, at least for China, is unattainable and not desirable, and they think a system like that would be totally superior to anything we invented in the West. Despite the fact that it looks very similar to what Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini tried to create, this is what the Chinese are set to do. Let's see if they succeed. We are working with a different model. Here's the benefit of being Western, is that we can take to the Persian heritage. Well, the Chinese can too, because Persia obviously between East and West, but let's say we regard the West as a Persian Hebrew axis. What the Persians did during the Bronze Age already is that they established that splitting power, again, the two-headed phallus, splitting the priest and the chief to begin with. So the Shah and Shah, the king of kings, and the Mobid and Mobid, the priest of priests, must never live in the same place, must never have the same court. They must have two distinctly different spheres within the empire. And then the population of the empire, meaning the matriarch, is the third installation in a triad that works. This structure of the Persian Empire was later inherited through the Mithraic orders. It was played with the Romans, but eventually it arrived in Europe, and the French taught it to the Americans, and it arrived in the US Constitution. It has worked really well for the Americans, because this is the one part of America that isn't Christian at all. There is no Christianity involved at all in the US Constitution. This is the other religion of America. This is the Freemason religion of America. This is the religion of free enterprise. And then Americans, of course, tried to create forms of Christianity and new religions that rhyme more with the sort of capitalism and individualism that is the American religion. But at the end of the day, they still have the US Constitution. That's what's important here. So what we're trying to do now is to see if we can create an idea of a sensocracy with power split in such a way from the very beginning that it isn't monolithically concentrated in one place. The problem with that is that we can't really tell the computer can't talk to other computers. So data is probably going towards this one point, central data accumulation for the entire planet, maybe the entire universe. And if that happens, then the whole empire as a dictatorship is probably unavoidable. And maybe it's then better that a machine is the dictator than a human being. Because the Chinese have their version of it, and we're struggling now with the Chinese to see if we can come up with another model, where I think the US Constitution is something we need to work from, and see what happens if we install from the very beginning within a sensocracy split power. So the sensocrats are replacing politics as we know it. Politics is dead and over because the satellites, the Internet of Things, all of these things, the data flows we have around us will be so fucking amazing once they start establish their power that what we call politics today would just die with it.
Are you saying that sensocracy is what replaces representative democracy?
Oh, representative democracy is dead already. It's dead and over. That's why having a laugh at it. That's why America selected Cartman for South Park as president and picked the Corona corpses to follow up. We can't take it seriously. We know it's so marginal in its influence on how things work. We know that the Federal Reserve don't care about politics, and the system itself is now operating at its own accord. And as long as power splitting is introduced to the system, we're fine with them. Democracy in itself, it's not a big deal at all to me. I mean, the Germans voted for Hitler in 1933. I'm not a democratist. I'm interested in systems, imperial systems, where power splitting is instituted in such a way that no single central power can control the others. So that's Netocracy. The third aspect of Netocracy is then where the shamanic comes in, the artistic comes in, where narrative itself comes in, and that is what we call protopians. So protopians are essentially people today who go to Burning Man and create huge camps and create art, and they try to get by with as little money as possible to be as independent as they possibly can. The digital nomads, they travel around the world, they cherish their freedom immensely, and they live in a sort of co-creative artistic space constantly. And that, I think, is the sound of protopians, and they're going to kill academia as we knew it. They're going to kill that immensely. They're going to replace the old monasteries and the academia, and the protopians are the drivers of religion. They're the drivers of religious thought and theology in the digital age.
All right, so I'm tempted here to play with this triad a little bit. Let's even call it the Netocratic Triad, if you're okay with that. So you have sort of like the techno-capitalists, you have the sensocrats, and you have the protopians, or the shamanic and the artistic class. How does this triad interact with each other? Is there any higher order perspective that you can give us from the triadic interaction?
Yeah, you do that through a theory called plurarchy. It's a horrible word, I know, but it's called plurarchy. The way plurarchy works is that you first think of populations being completely anarchic. There's an anarchy here. There's no organization at all. Eventually, what will happen quite quickly, just to survive in that environment, you need to trust certain leaders. So by coincidence, some people become nodes in that network. Then those nodes build little pyramids around themselves, where there's a node at the very top and then other nodes further down and further down and further down. And that's how you control a society. It's essentially like a pyramid. Like, it's called a network pyramid. Literally, it's a guy at the top, and then all the way down to other guys further down. Then you can have several guys at the top. You get a larger pyramid, a larger structure. So for the Chinese, for example, this is where you go from Xi Jinping to the Chinese Communist Party. You get a much bigger network pyramid, controls a larger population. But once you establish these plurarchies, there's no longer just anarchy any longer. There are plurarchies, and they tend to look very tribal. Why? Because humans tend to go towards tribal size. Once you have the plurarchies established, it's only a question of time before the leaders of the different plurarchies start talking directly to each other. That's an elite. That's a masterclass. So yes, you will experience that the informationalists will find each other. Silicon Valley is where they started that. You will experience the protopians will find each other. Ironically, there was Burning Man, places like that where they found each other and started doing art in a whole new collaborative, interactive way. And that exploded, and it becomes, participatory culture today is really the spirituality of the 21st century. So then the third one is the sensocrats, and that's, of course, a technical overlay of what we used to call politics. Before that, it was the monarchy. So it requires a chain of events where there's no break. Otherwise, you get a revolution that gets bloody. So let's see then how politics dissolves and is being replaced by sensocracy. Politicians will eventually give away whatever formal power they have to a function that already has all the real power. The real power is moved somewhere else. And that is a result of data accumulation and the processing of the data, in the sense that you want to control people and control the world. We call it the police state, normally, if we're frank about it, right? So we will We will have the police state. The question is, will we have just a police state, or we'll have different competing police states that we can walk in between? Definitely desirable to me to have different police states competing, wouldn't you say? Is there a market of police states, or is it just one global police state? Still an open question, but that's sensocracy where that comes into the picture.
It seems like, at least in regards to our little internal network, there is a way in which we probably most comfortably fit within the protopian shamanic artistic class. I think you could also add philosophy into that mix as well. I think there's one concept left in Nietzsche, or at least one core concept left in Nietzsche that I think it would be interesting to get the Bardian perspective on, and that's the concept of the eternal return. How do you make sense of the eternal return? There's many different interpretations from Deleuze and Heidegger and so forth, but what's the Bardian view?
Okay, so Nietzsche is really the death of the state as we know it, the death of the nation state as we know it. Nietzsche is really the death of academia as we know it. Nietzsche is the death of mass media as we know it today. Nietzsche is the death of industry as we know it. Most of all, Nietzsche is the death of advertising. Here's my one-liner. We will in the future regard the abolition of advertising as a greater achievement for humanity than the abolition of slavery. That's why we hate advertising. This is the real implication of understanding the death of God. It's the understanding that an old paradigm is already dead. It's just around. And it's now being run by mediocre, bitter people because nobody else wants to run it any longer. That's
before advertising dies. Can I just give a little plug for the Thus Spoke Zarathustra course coming up July 15th? No,
that's just information. That's not advertising. You didn't get paid to say it, right? But I want to emphasize that before we talk about the eternal recurrence of the same. So the eternal recurrence of the same, just like monism looked fresh when it came with Spinoza, because nobody in the West had even thought about it, which was pathetic. In the same way, when Nietzsche thinks the eternal recurrence of the same, historically speaking, it's pathetic. So what happens in the 20th century, starting with Mircea Eliade, is that all the anthropologists, of course, discover that all thinking was the eternal recurrence of the same up until a certain point in history. So Nietzsche was right in the sense that he loved Heraclitus more than he loved Plato because he understood that flux was more fundamental than form. And he was right. And he brought him back to the Persians. Nietzsche brings the Persians into Western thinking because he prioritizes Heraclitus over Plato. Even Heidegger does the same thing. And as a bargain, they also get the acceptance of death as the absolute, because that comes once you get Plato out of the way. You go back to Heraclitus. When you die, you die. Your own existence is merely a little breeze on the top of a flux, and there's nothing else to it.
Or as my granddad said, when you're dead, you're dead.
Like Heraclitus' student wonderfully said, being more Heraclitus than Heraclitus himself. And Heraclitus said, you can't put the same foot into the same river twice. The student said, it's not even the same foot. It's not even the same you. Okay. Nietzsche got this. He understood this was profound, and he also realized it's older than forms. What Nietzsche maybe didn't get, though, is that the eternal recurrence of the same is an older concept than the concept of the event. And this brings me to my work currently with John Söderqvist. Our next book is called Process and Event. It's going to come out in 2023. It's going to complete our grand narrative trilogy with Synthesis and Digital Libido are the two first books. And we wrote Synthesis about the future first, and we wrote Digital Libido about the current state of things. And then we're writing Process and Event. We're rewriting the history. We're very Hegelian here. They will write everything backwards. But in Process and Event, we argue that process is pagan. And we call it Nomadology, taking the word from Gilles Deleuze, who is, of course, a Nietzschean. Nomadology means that as long as we're on the move, our worldview will be obsessed with our movement, meaning flux comes naturally to us. We're constantly on the move. If you don't get up the next day and walk, you're dead. And let the oldest woman in the tribe walk at the very back. And if you're behind her, you're dead. So behind her is nothing but chaos. Chaos is always a goddess. Ahead of you is the fellows, ahead of you is the promised land, ahead of you is where we're going next. We're going towards a certain paradise where our daughters will give birth 9 months after the ritual, and therefore we have to create enormous prosperity, and we have to defend ourselves and protect and provide for the entire tribe until we arrive in the valley where paradise is, and there we can give birth to all the children, and our tribe can survive and move on, and maybe even split itself into several tribes. if we're successful, right? That whole model is called nomadology in our work. So we complete Gilles Deleuze's concept of the nomadology by making it more Nietzschean. This is the eternal recurrence of the same. So we take Deleuze's version of the eternal recurrence of the same even one step further. However, what Deleuze does beautifully in his book Difference and Repetition in the 1960s is that he takes Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence of the same and discusses the loops. And he then radically says that with every loop, there's a small deviation. And the small deviation from the previous loop, the loop is never exact, right? Because then it would be Platonist. It would be form. It isn't. The loop, once it comes back to about the same place, has a deviation attached to it. That deviation enables the possibility for an event. Gilles Deleuze calls his book Différence and Répétition. We just switched the title and called our book Process and Event because we say process is first, the repetition is first. And then after the process has been discussed, the repetition has been discussed, we can look at the difference. And this is the possibility of the event. And Zoroaster's great discovery 3,700 years ago, when he broke with what was essentially Persian Hinduism and reformed the pagan religion, was that he said the event is possible. We must never ignore the process. It was deeply Nietzschean. We must never ignore the process. Absolutely fundamental. We can even associate the process with the female body if we want to, and associate the male body with the event. But the event is the possibility for something to happen so that it changes history forever. And in our philosophy, in Nietzsche, in Deleuze, that alone is the value. Not that it's a world for the better. Just because we've done the repeated world, we could still live the repeated world. We would accept the repeated world. We don't have a problem being pagan. But if the possibility arises, which is the phallic event, if the possibility arises that the world could take off in a whole new direction, it's worth taking the risk because the repetition has been done. And in that sense, the repetition having been done becomes just meaningless if it's repeated. That possibility is the possibility of the new value. This is where paradigmatic starts. Paradigmatics must be the unity of the process and event. The problem with Eastern religion becoming that it became so obsessed with the process that it skipped the event. There were several attempts, both in Chinese and Indian culture, to bring back event into process, but they often failed. And India and China, as you meet them in the end of the 19th century, are totally process-related cultures without event. The problem with the West was that once Islam and Christianity took over in the West, they liked to think of the event without the process. And event without the process becomes either the boy pharaoh, which is Islam, or it becomes the pillar saint, which is Christianity. They're both kind of infantile moralities rather than slave moralities. They're infantile moralities, I would say. So I disagree with Nietzsche here. It's not about master slave. It's really about infantile moralities. It's like an 11-year-old who refuses to grow up, but still wants to have all the power of the grown-up, or even infinite power, but doesn't want to commit to any of the necessities, any of the requirements for being an adult. This is the dream of the Muslim. This is the dream of the Christian. This is the dark side of Christianity and Islam, is that it doesn't take responsibility for life as it is here and now. It just escapes the problem by talking about a New Jerusalem or some other escapism that, oh, if things get too fucked up, I ask God for forgiveness and suddenly I get everything I should have done myself. No wonder that the reversal of that is a fundamentalism where you blow up children with bombs because God won't do it. It comes as a natural reversal of the problem with Islam and Christianity that I have, fundamentally. The West problem is event without process. The East problem is process without event. For me, to read Nietzsche and to really go into the spirit of Nietzsche today is to understand that the event is a possibility. If it occurs, we should take it. But if it doesn't arrive, we're perfectly okay with living everything as it always was, because then we'll live it in a way that we would do it exactly the same way if we were offered the same position again. This is to live both with process and event. It's probably the most fiendish, difficult thing you can think of. But to live with process and event is to be a Zoroastrian, it's to be a Nietzschean, it's to be Hegelian. And I think where we arrive after the revolution in 19th century Germany is that it becomes inescapable for us to not deal with the fact that we must both have process and event. We must both live in a cyclical time. We must both live in a linear time at the same time. Otherwise, we do not have a culture worth fighting for.
Yeah, I think that a lot of this logic that you're articulating is not only a foundation for process and event, but also a foundation for a lot of our shared work. And I think that that's a really good segue into potentially getting some deeper insight into your latest trilogy, Syntheism, Digital Libido, and Process and Event. Perhaps starting with Syntheism, how do you think Nietzsche's work really is incorporated and included into your larger aim?
Oh, the death of God, to us, if we take it literally, means that if God never existed, then it doesn't mean God will never exist. So what we're talking about at Syntheism is the birth of God, literally. We take that from Quentin Melassu, a French colleague. He's a bit in hiding, but he's a brilliant mind. And if you don't have any other name for the absolutely unbelievable, if that would happen in the future, the only name we have for that would be the birth of God. So we discussed that seriously. And of course, the premise here is that number one, women give birth to children. Number two, men envy women for giving birth to children. Number three, men therefore give birth to technology. Number four, since technology does develop over time, whereas children do not, it's only a question of time before five, technology kills the child. It's just a very Hegelian logic. And that's the premise for the book. And of course, we had guys over at Google who wanted to build God right away. We tell them, no, it's too early, right? It's too early. You don't even know what you're doing. To begin with, the God we're creating here is what will replace government. To begin with, what will replace the king, or what will replace the president or the Congress in our society and politics as we know it. Who will be the leader in the future to begin with? So we must treat carefully here. Or maybe we have to go fast because technology develops that fast. We don't know that yet. But the pointer is to point out that we are literally creating a technology that could also mean that we as human beings could become extinct, and happily so. Like if our own death drive eventually points somewhere, humanity's death drive as a collective points anywhere, is that we must fantasize about the day when humanity is over. And that's what you and I go into in our work. So when you and I work on the Negatology at the moment, we're of course going into death as the absolute. And one of the aspects of death as the absolute is, what would it mean to think the death of mankind as a conscious thing? Because we cannot go on forever and ever and ever in the process without an event. And to dare to think the event is to dare to think an event that one day would make us go extinct. But what would make us think that going extinct would be an okay idea?
Yeah, I actually discussed that a little bit at the Stoa last night, is just this thought experiment about actually a lot of people do have the unconscious presupposition where they're eternalizing humanity. They're not able to think this.
We should kill that. You and I should kill that. Nobody else that we should kill that. I know other thinkers have thought similar patterns, but once and for all, let's take death as the absolute, as an absolute necessity, and think it through thoroughly. That's why our book is called The Negatology. So you're working in parallel with me and John. We should say that because John and I are working process event, which is basically rewriting the history of ideas. But of course, hidden beneath the event, what reminded you in pagan society that the event was a possibility was the fact that people did die and they didn't return. And they were supposed to be reincarnated somewhere else. You never ever saw them again. And when people you love died from you, you never got to see them again. They were dead. And since they were dead, they left a hole. And that lack they left, death itself, is the negation in Hegel. And it enables the negation of the negation. We know, for example, looking at history, it's only when civilizations collapse and nature collapses on us and things like that, the really radical things start happening. The real revolutions are the ones that are forced on us. Not the ones that we create through our ideas, because we never do that. We're too lazy for it, and we're too arrogant and too decadent for that. But as human beings, what really forces us into revolutions are, for example, now when digital finally happens, and it's like a huge ghost, and digital takes over the world, and it takes the world away from us. And the way to look at it from the synthesis perspective is basically to say that, do you seriously think human beings will ever conquer outer space? Seriously? Obviously, we're going to send off a technological intelligence that can survive in any environment. And it will go off on its own and take some bacteria, whatever, with it that it finds useful when it goes to Mars or whatever. It will not take human beings with it, because human beings are crap in outer space. We go mad in 3 days. Radiation kills us. So a perfect example of something we might want to give birth to not as children, but as technology, is to give birth to technology to take over the universe. And it might then allow us to stay as a human zoo or something on this planet. I don't know.
Right. Well, I've often had the idea played with a little bit in my PhD thesis, but just the idea that actually, when you think about the 20th century science fiction fantasies of something like a Star Wars or a Star Trek, these are deeply anti-scientific images in some sense because they sort of don't take into consideration Darwinian science in the sense of human beings adapted to the Earth. And in order to go into outer space, whatever human beings are now would have to adapt towards something totally different to the point where they would be post-humans, basically. Whatever they are, they...
Exactly. And we are now rewriting history itself accordingly. So the digital revolution gone at the moment, there's so many historians doing that in different ways. But what we'll finally arrive at is that our ideas did not drive history at all. What drove history was necessary changes in our environments. The topology changed, including the material topology and technological topology. And when we arrive in a new landscape, we feel very uncomfortable about it. But if we adjust quickly and hungrily and greedily even, we become successful. And I think that is the real lesson from Nietzsche. When you merge Nietzsche with Darwin, is to understand that a new master race or a new master class of any given society were lucky enough to get the new tools in their hands at an early stage. Didn't know what to do with them, but they had nothing. They gained nothing from the previous paradigm. They weren't winners in the previous paradigm. They just were lucky enough to be around, to find the tools in their hands, to be able to then experiment with those tools and therefore establish a new paradigm. And this is what we call paradigmatics. This is the creation of new values in Nietzsche. Very firmly so.
Well, I think after having had the chance to discuss some of the foundations of Nietzschean concepts from a Barthian perspective and also getting some deeper insight into what opened up syntheism and the rest of your work, it might be time now to sort of explore some concepts which I would call kind of IDW concepts, things that we often discuss on the intellectual deep web and things that appear in your work. And you just mentioned paradigmatics. So why don't you give sort of an overview on what do you mean by paradigmatics and how can we think about that maybe from a Nietzschean point of view?
The only reasonable values ever created are paradigmatic. Paradigm, meaning there are timeless values that are very hard to rock and you shouldn't rock them at all. We might want to live in a gender-free society, but we don't. There are no humans. There are men and women and a few guys in between. So we have to take that into perspective. We have to live with who we are. Otherwise, the real comes back to haunt us. If we live in fantasy worlds that are so distant from reality that we can't live in them, the real come back to haunt us. So number one, find the timeless aspects of what it means to be human. Then look at the time-specific aspects. How do you train your child to become a winner in the paradigm in which you live? And those are time-specific aspects. And I would say the more we look at human history of the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, we discover that the timeless aspects are often tied to biology, and the time-specific aspects are tied to technology. So fundamentally, look at the biological conditioning for your values and then the technological conditioning for your values, and you find a mix that we call paradigmatics. So Nietzsche's idea of creating brand new values out of nothing, no, that's not what this means. Paradigmatics just means that creating values that work in the society in which you live. Taoism, Zoroastrianism, even Buddhism have done this in the past. It's time to do it in the West. And the way we create paradigmatic values today is to start from Hegel and Nietzsche.
Right on. I don't necessarily. I kind of want to build up towards sort of like maybe a final meditation on how we might play with Hegel and Nietzsche. So let's save that for a teaser. But in regards to the timeless and the time-specific values being tied to biology and tech, I think that these time-specific values, namely the ones related to tech, can often be extremely disruptive to the timeless ones, namely biology. And I think that that leads in really nicely to distinctions that are often discussed on the IDW of Tantra versus Sutra. Basically, that the time-specific values of tech have disrupted the sutra of the old world, let's say. I think that's connected to what you criticize, let's say, in Christianity and Islam. So how should we be thinking about Tantra and Sutra in the 21st century? Of course, Nietzsche is a very tantric individual. You've already pointed towards that. He is a shamanic psyche who is able to do things that, let's say, most people shouldn't do. But what's your view on this Tantra versus Sutra distinction?
Well, Nietzsche is struggling with his mom and with his very mediocre but hardworking sister. He's also struggling against his Protestant Christian father. So when he deals with Christianity, he does as a shaman. He says Christianity is it's done its work. It did whatever it's supposed to do, but it's dead and over. And here's what we must do. Right. So that's Nietzsche's personal project. It's understandably, dialectically speaking, a very tantric project. And again, to be fair to Nietzsche, because he's very much an unfinished philosopher. He's not an unfinished writer. He's Goethe 2.0 in a way. But if you look at him as a second Goethe, then you can read him richly, right? But as a thinker, he opens up a lot of doors, but he leaves many unfinished projects behind. One of them is that he doesn't seriously discuss the Tantra Sutra divide. So in Eastern thinking, it's absolutely necessary to differentiate between the Sutric truth and the Tantric truth. This is even the case in Judaism, certainly the case in Zoroastrianism, certainly in any Eastern philosophy. What this means is that the Sutric truth in a given society is the story about the society that teaches people to love their children. You must never risk that. You cannot risk that. You cannot be so damn irresponsible to ever risk that. So you must keep certain genies inside certain bottles if you know more than that. So if you go into the Tantric realm, you go into the incessant pursuit of truth, no matter what. You are committed to that, and you must have a psyche that handles that. You must be truly shamanic to be able to go into that realm, because you might even end up with absolute madness if you do so. It's incredibly risk-taking. It's only for those who are called to do it. It's there because the Tantric is there. It's there because the world operates that way. It's there because the ultimate truth is always a Tantric truth. So you go into that realm. We call it pathos in our work. It's the work of really advanced sex. It's really advanced drugs. It's psychoanalysis, definitely tantric, right? The difference between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis is that psychotherapy is sutric. Psychotherapy is about healing you, fixing you, sending back into society to love your children, to go to work. Psychoanalysis is just the incessant pursuit of truth, no matter what, even if you freak out. You're asking, if an analyst, and you're asking the psychoanalyst, I do want to know everything about me and my place in the world, no matter how hard the truth is, no matter how horrible it feels, no matter what the consequences are. I want to know the truth. And that incessant pursuit of truth in Eastern philosophy is tantric. Now, these two things must never meet. That means you must have you have stairs outside the temple from which the priest preaches to the people. What he preaches is the sutra. He preaches how they must love their children. He must give them a good story so that they all walk the next day, so the nomadology is intact. And maybe also give them hope that something will come along that changes their lives forever, and give them the event. But there must be sutric versions of that. The opposite of the sutric version is the tantric version that's inside the temple itself. It's the holy of the holy rooms. It's a sacred truth, and that can only be pursued and shared by those who have a specific mindset. And the first thing they must do is to have what we call the barred absolute. The barred absolute is this definite wall between the Tantra and the Sutra. The ones who are inside the Tantric realm, you renegade on everything you achieved in your Sutric world. You have no interest in the Sutric world any longer. You go into the Tantric world, you commit yourself completely to it, because you commit yourself to the collective, incessant pursuit of truth within that realm. Now, we live in a world today, we live with the consequence of Christianity and Islam, and following that also capitalism, that all were religions of what we call the cult of transparency. Everything was let out in the open. Therefore, now people are creating homemade guns in Japan. So the American debate on gun control is already over and done with. You can do as much gun control as you like, because people create their own homemade guns anyway and go kill whoever they like from now on in history. It's horrible. Cryptocurrencies mean that people can order somebody to murder you without a single track of who did it and ordered it. So we already have these anarchies around us because we let genius out of the bottle without knowing what we're doing. And if Iran blows up the atomic bomb in the next few months, we might then also start thinking that, at the end of the day, forget about climate change. The real existential threat to humanity was always the bomb. And I repeatedly said that the 6th of August, 1945 is by far the most important event in modern history. for good or bad. We blew up the bomb over Hiroshima. We knew there was no going back. Death as the absolute had really arrived. We'd created it. This was death as technology, mass death as technology, the atomic bomb, right? And if the atomic bombs proliferate, we're done, right? These genies coming out of the bottles right now, historically speaking, this is digital libido. The book discusses that. These genies coming out of the bottle shows that we have no control over the Tantra of the Sutra any longer in our society. And to a certain extent, Nietzsche is responsible for that, because Nietzsche was so incessant in his pursuit of Tantra that he did so publicly and let it all out. And thankfully, few people read his books back then. At least by then, we could also debate those books before they got popular. But Nietzsche pursued Tantra without knowing that maybe some of what he pursued, he should have just kept to himself or to a close group. Most Tantric religion may never be written down. That has been the case for 4,000 years. There's a reason why. Okay? So I think we need to start pursuing Tantric truth separately from Sutric truth. And this is where Thomas Hammerich and Andrew Sweeney and I have agreed in our work, and John Sedekis and I agree in our work. The pursuit of a difference between Sutra and Tantra is what we must import from the East, implement in Western culture instantly. Because we have exactly the problems today because we mix the two. And we did it because we went for the Sutric completely and then let the Tantric go into the Sutric all over the place as a pressure cooker that boiled over, right? So capitalism became the Tantric, Christianity was the Sutric, and in parallel to it, and blew us up.
I think it's an interesting distinction, and also maybe an interesting side note that when Nietzsche was becoming Nietzsche, still as a teenager, one of the dimensions of his philosophical awakening was this distinction between truth and pleasure, and the pursuit of truth at all costs, no matter if it was unpleasurable, which I think goes towards the tantric mindset. But it seems to be that there needs to be a certain dialectics as it relates to truth as the pursuit of no matter what the cost is, as opposed to truth as it's sort of like most of the masses need a certain, let's say, barred absolute.
And the truth, again, then has to be split. Again, like will to power, because it's a reflection of will to power and truth, right? So the truth has to be split the same way if you're going to be more Nietzschean than Nietzsche himself. You have to split the truth between truth as a fact, which is will to intelligence. Like what is the world like? How do things operate? Science, truth as a fact, right? Up until now, where it can be established, because everything that's happened has happened. It's nailed. History is always nailed. And that's truth as a fact. The other one is truth as an act. And truth as an act, for example, in Alain Badiou is really important here. It's the ethical decision to personify truth at all times. It's actually Zoroastrian again. It's going from Asha, which is how the world operates, to Asha Vahishta, which is to personify the truth as it is, right? So I personify truth. Taoism does the same thing with the Tao. So the personification of the truth, to be true is that, is to be, for example, the martyr who says what needs to be said, or the prophet says what needs to be said, and people throw rocks at him to kill him. He couldn't care less, right? That sort of shamanic attitude that I'm just doing my job. I don't care what you think of me. I'm just proud of doing my job. I am truth. I personify the truth that I'm speaking. I know that I'm right. And more than knowing that I'm right, it's more that I've decided that I'm right. Knowing that I'm right is actually on the truth as a fact, but I have decided that I'm right and I will act on that decision is truth as an act. So truth is also split between the will to intelligence and the will to transcendence. And therefore, I think to think of will to power as a sort of an, not infantile, but as an unfinished idea is to allow it to split. And then we can allow a third will as well, which is the will to reproduce, which is the will to give birth to children. And to be part of that process, the process of reproduction, which automatically is biological. We don't have to learn it; it's there already. But it is a will, right? And if you have the will to reproduce as a third one, to balance the will to intelligence and balance the will to transcendence, you basically figure out what a tribal will to power would look like.
I'm tempted to ask, now that you bring up this third will as the will to reproduce, how do you see the conflict that plays out? Especially in contemporary times when we think about the time-specific technological values versus the timeless biological values. How do you see the will to reproduce playing out as it relates to the future technology that I think you state will kill the child.
Well, will to reproduce is not only giving birth to children, it's also just becoming a craftsman.
Okay.
So you learn a craft from your master, you copy your master, and you do the same thing. So when your master dies, you can do what he did.
So will to reproduce is linked to also the masculine drive to create technology.
It is, and not to create technology, but to maintain technology, maintain know-how. So a monk in a monastery just rewriting the same text and putting it in new text, making a copy of it, etc., in case there's a fire. All of that. There's a will to reproduction that's prevalent everywhere in human society. Most of us are actually in a mode of the sort of reproduction at most times. And that's not marginal in itself, because it is then accompanied with a libidinal force as well. And libidinal force takes the expression the will to intelligence, which is a form of accumulation. So there's already there a change. You are between the process and event where you are in the will to intelligence. You go into the event when you go into the will to transcend. You're firmly in the process itself when you reproduce. So if we think of process and event as two things of the tribe itself, and you can explore the tribal will to power, the collective will to power, expressing itself, it would express itself in these three ways. Now, Jan and I concentrate, of course, on the phallic, because we need to understand the will to intelligence and the will to transcend better. And we leave the will to reproduction to biologists, basically, to understand, because to me, that's more like a scientific, or at most a psychological endeavor. It's not really a philosophical endeavor, because whatever follows from something isn't philosophically that interesting, because what's philosophically interesting even when something is invented and where it comes from. And it's a first you study. Philosophy is an art form. It has to say something entirely new that nobody said before, or at least awaken something that was forgotten. That's what philosophy needs to do, whereas just the reproduction of something. For example, becoming a philosophy teacher is a will to reproduce in relation to philosophy. Becoming a philosopher is either will to intelligence, like I'm accumulating all the philosophical knowledge up until now. Boom, here it is. Or is it will to transcend it? From knowing all of philosophy until now, I then start exploring new directions philosophy could take. And here you see how the three different wills are all the will to power, but they're archetypical. So you give different archetypes to different parts, and there's no single individual in the whole thing that has a will to power left, which is exactly the point. I think Nietzsche's will to power has to be understood as a Hegelian empty or Lacanian empty subject.
So is this the first time I've heard you talk about the will to power as split between the will to intelligence and the will to transcendence? Is this the first time you're articulating it as a triad and introducing the will to reproduce, or have you done that elsewhere?
No, I haven't done that elsewhere, to be honest about it, but it's a consequence of it, because when you think of the triads, you study one or two sides of the triad, so the third triad is often an axiom that's given. I don't consider reproduction as something philosophers necessarily have to deal with. And maybe some female philosophers love to dig into it. It's probably closer to their hearts than mine. But it isn't. It is something I'd rather gladly leave to biology and science to deal with and see how reproduction actually works and how it motivates us. Because for women, I think the sexual intercourse is about reproduction. For man, it's really about transcendence. That's the difference. That's why the event lies on the masculine side, whereas the process firmly lies on the female side. As the bastion of all human culture is feminine. The platform is always feminine, and on that comes the phallic. Onto the feminine comes the phallic.
Well, let's leave the philosophical dimensions of the will to reproduce with someone like Raven Connolly. She might be able to think and help us think that.
Brilliant. Yeah.
I think we're ready for it, Bard. Hegel versus Nietzsche. Hegel versus Nietzsche. I think it's a philosophical relationship which has been underthought in the modern world. I think that there have been many different philosophers that have been put into deep dialogue with each other, but I think a lot of philosophers have missed this connection between Hegel and Nietzsche, and sometimes this is on the basis of thinking that Nietzsche is anti-Hegelian and there's nothing to think here. How do you understand the relationship between these two giants?
If we add a third again, then it would be Goethe. In this, as Goethe was such a master of the mythos, that the other two ways in narratology has three different ways that human beings conduct stories about themselves. It's mythos, logos, and pathos, right? And if the mythos was so strong in Goethe, I would say that Hegel is the master of the logos and Nietzsche is the master of the pathos. And it starts from lack. In Hegel, it starts from a lack that he's frustrated with Kant and the guys before him. He's frustrated that they can't see themselves in the very processes they're talking about. It's like Kant is external to his own process, and Hegel has a laugh at that. And Hegel's genius was to realize that. But if I just look at Kant as being part of the very process that Kant is discussing, and it's just a loop, it's a dialectical loop, and there's nothing else there. Oh God, I'll go back to dialectics. Oh, Plato did it, Aristotle did it, but wait, it's all the way back to Heraclitus, right? So dialectical process. What if dialectical process is the shit? What if the world could be understood exclusively through it? Well, Hegel made a safe bet in the sense that you cannot think in any other way logically than thinking through dialectics. So Hegel was safe. He created the most brilliant method ever conceived, and it deserves to be called absolute knowledge simply because of it, right? So I always tell people, don't worry about Hegel's own personal opinions about anything. He's not concerned with them himself. He's concerned with the method. He's concerned with the absolute perfection of dialectics that he conducted. So if you think of dialectics that way, Hegel is safe in the sense that at least we know we cannot think any other way than dialectically, and we cannot talk to each other any other way than dialectically. So social discourse is also dialectical, and our own thinking is dialectical. So anything human beings pursue when they think is dialectical by nature. Okay, that was a safe bet Hegel did. Now, the heritage after Hegel, if you attempt to be more Hegel than Hegel himself, is to think that maybe the whole universe operates in a dialectical manner. And of course, it turns out when it goes to physics in the 20th century that, it is zeros and ones at the very bottom of things too. You go all the way down to the Planck length and it's on and off things. And oh God, it is quanta. Oh, it is zeros and ones all the way through. It is still continuities, and weirdly enough, the world is both. A bit like we must both understand the world as circular time and linear time, and we have to accept both. Otherwise, we cannot have a complete narratology. The same thing goes for the natural sciences themselves. There is both continuities and there are also discretions. Endlessly fascinating. So even for the continuities and the discretions to have a relationship with one another can only be solved through dialectics. So the way we can describe the world is that it's pan-dialectical. Hegel never used the word we do. Okay, what else is what else is to it? Well, it's also, we always have this argument between determinism and indeterminism, and it arrives at a position when you do science is that indeterminism and determinism ends up being very local qualities. Like local systems can look deterministic or they can look indeterministic. But you cannot say the universe itself is either or, because you can have an indeterminist chain that as a larger chain can look deterministic. You can know where it's going to arrive, but you can't know the way it's going to get there, for example. So, all right, what do we do with determinism and indeterminism then? Just disqualify them? No. Well, look at what Hegel said. Hegel said that the past is a necessity, the future is a contingency, they're united in the present. That's a deadlock, a contradiction, because you can't say the present is either necessary or contingent. So the world must then be described as being transdeterministic. And if it's transdeterministic, it's fundamentally dialectical. The funny thing is that, at least in my pursuit, I haven't gone down to anything. And with you, I've gone down to the very bottom of what dialectics could possibly be. If dialectics is fundamental to reality, it is that we formulated with our one-liner, negation is a crack in the oscillation. And this is where we unite Hegel and Nietzsche. If Nietzsche, as the thinker of pathos in Western philosophy, is the thinker of oscillation, he brings back Heraclitus firmly and puts flux as first principle. That's oscillation. Everything oscillates. Nothing is ever fixed. Actually, minimum energy consumption in any state, even in physics, is always oscillating. It's never fixed because it takes more energy to fix something than it is for something to move around. So oscillation is so fundamental, even in physics, that we can describe that as a fundamental property. Now, oscillation then has anything that it relates to. It is that oscillation itself is nothing but chaos. So there has to be some kind of order to the oscillation. And the order of the oscillation starts with a death of some kind. It starts with an implosion of some kind. It starts with something that's no longer there. It starts with a lack to the oscillation, a negation. Meaning a fundamental dialectical process can be described as a dialectics between negation and oscillation. And I think that's where you and I arrived, and we are exploring it further.
I think that in regards to the negation and the oscillation, do you see Hegel as more aligned with the negation and Nietzsche more on the side of the oscillation? Is this why they need to be put in some sort of relationship with each other?
They would agree on that, but the way Nietzsche again is unfinished is that his concept of nihilism is unfinished. I was frustrated and also proud when Ray Boissier brought out Nihil Unbound. That's like 12 years ago or something. A magnificent book, but it also closes the idea of a sort of monistic idea of nihilism. Like nihilism is one thing, like Nietzschean nihilism is one thing. I say nihilism must again be described as paradigmatic. So we create values all the time. If we have a libido, if we deny the fact we want to die, so we want to live instead, that's enough for us to create a libido. And if the libido is there, even if it's a denial, that's fine. This is again digital libido. That's fundamentally value. So we create values all the time. But the old values must die if the paradigm dies. And therefore, nihilism needs to go through 4 different stages. And the interesting thing is that the first one is naive nihilism. You don't know that your God is dead. So you're behaving as if God is still around, still believing you believe God is around, but your subconscious or your unconscious already convinced God's dead and God's out the door. So you subconsciously behave as if God does not exist. You will consciously think you still try to struggle with God being around. Like you're getting frustrated. You're becoming a fundamentalist, things like that. Then comes cynical nihilism. Cynical nihilism is that God is dead, you're not going to tell anybody because you're going to behave as if God's still around. I always tell, it's like, well, Hillary Clinton goes to church on Sunday. Not a single American thinks she believes in God. But she goes to church on Sunday anyway, pretending, emperor being naked, that she can still claim to be Christian in case she can win votes out of it. That's how cynical she is. Cynical nihilism, I know God is dead. You all know that God is dead. We all know that God is dead. Let's behave as God's still around. Jordan Peterson, for example. Let's live as if God was still around, which is cynical nihilism. It won't work, but it can work for a while. Then after cynical nihilism, there's ironic nihilism and affirmative nihilism. And affirmative nihilism, what Nietzsche is fascinated with. This is when Nietzsche is the Overman. This is when Nietzsche goes up on the mountain and says, I will now from scratch create new values. I will affirm the new paradigm. But Nietzsche is also ironic, meaning the ironic nihilism also exists in Nietzsche. And I struggled with this for years. Like, why is the ironic nihilism, the affirmative nihilism, not a chain? Why don't you go through ironic nihilism to become affirmative nihilism? Why are there parallels? And I discovered it's precisely where the Sutra Tantra divide is in culture. The priests always knew that God was dead, but they behaved as if God existed because the people asked them to. So people ask the priest to go and talk to the God. The priest goes and talks to the other priests who collectively then become God. They give advice. You go back then to the believer and says that this is what God says. This is the advice. Confession booths, everything operates that way. So if that's ironic nihilism, then some people are outside of the paradigm entirely. That's a tantric realm. The tantric realm doesn't care about technological conditions. It doesn't care about power in the world you live in. That's why you often give away everything you own before you become truly tantric, because you don't want to have any connection to the sutric world. You just want to live in service of the sutric world so that it can reproduce itself and maybe even improve on itself. You're there to serve it, but you've chosen to stay outside of it, say in a monastery or something, to go tantric. Now, that's Tantra and Sutra. So I discovered that if I did Tantra Sutra divide, which is not clear in Nietzsche, he goes for the tantric, he goes for the affirmative, without understanding he's also being ironic. And interestingly, he's so smart, he's so clever that you find both the ironic Nietzsche and the affirmative Nietzsche parallel to one another. And this is where I'll Sprach Zarathustra goes through the roof, becomes intensely great literature, because you can trace both the ironic nihilism and the affirmative nihilism Nietzsche. Now, if you bring this back to Hegel, this is exactly Hegelian dialectics. That's how it operates. There is a frustration, naive nihilism, with abstraction. There is definitely then a process. You go through the cynical nihilism, you're dealing with abstraction, you're angry with abstraction. You realize that the only way for you to do something is for God to die, which means you become a cynical nihilist. So you pick up the cynical nihilism, you take it into, and that's the negation, and it kickstarts the whole process. So you get rid of the abstraction, move towards the concretion, which is the affirmative. Beneath all this, you can be as ironic as you like, because that's being in the absolute knowing with Hegel. You just observe the whole dialectical process as if it was external to you if you move into the tantric realm with Hegel, whereas you can stay in the sutric realm with Hegel as well, because in Hegel, Tantra and Sutra are parallel operations. And the only thing lacking in Nietzsche is so interested in. That's why I say Nietzsche is the greatest philosopher for artists you could think of. He's really a philosopher of art. He deals with Wagner and all that, but he really is a philosopher of art and music and creative. He's a philosopher of the pathos. And if you're going to look back at the three giant Germans of the 19th century, I think we should discuss starting with allowing Goethe to be the master of the mythos, as the master literature guy that he is. He's the Shakespeare of German culture, and then after Goethe, discuss Hegel as the master of the logos and Nietzsche as the master of the pathos. And it starts to make sense, so you can work with that triad. And especially what we do in philosophy is, of course, to unify Hegel and Nietzsche here.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective. And in my own, for example, reading of The Science of Logic, it's hard not to conclude that Hegel is not the ultimate logos. And in reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it's hard not to conclude that Nietzsche is not the ultimate pathos. You're introducing something new there by talking about Goethe, but making this also involving the mythos is an interesting angle. But I think with this, Bard, let's try and wind it down. Do you have any final thoughts or final reflections for the people listening on the future of Nietzsche? We've discussed a lot about, for example, Nietzsche's influence from Zoroastrianism. We got a very interesting perspective from you as a Zoroastrian on that idea. We've gone through the Bardian perspectives on many fundamental Nietzschean concepts, and we've basically built up towards this really interesting potential philosophical relationship that's been underexplored in the modern world between Hegel and Nietzsche. What would be some final thoughts here for this conversation?
I'd say the final words would be that Hegel does the negation and does it properly, and then it offers us the negation of the negation. The negation of the negation in Hegel is the affirmation in Nietzsche. Start from there and make a comparative study between the two thinkers as thinkers. And I think you'll start to get it right. And there's so much richness coming out of this. I've said it to you all along that if we still regard ourselves as being part of the Western philosophical discourse, then the two giants we work with constantly are Hegel and Nietzsche, and precisely because they are the masters of the two narratives. They were expert at the two narratives. They pursued, judging from their personality types, they pursued archetypologically. They went for the logos and the pathos the way they did. That's why it also makes sense for Nietzsche to arrive in the late 19th century. He didn't have to worry about Hegel. Hegel had done his work already, Political science, everything. Everybody was busy with Hegel anyway, who was supposed to be busy with Hegel at the time. What Nietzsche was concerned with is that, okay, so in the culture we now create, probably going towards our own extinction eventually, even if that's far away, then what could we possibly establish? And he's interested in this idea. Then what does it mean to create a new paradigm? What does it mean to accept the old paradigm has died from you, undeniably died from you? What does it mean to deal with the ghosts of the old paradigm? The ghosts of the old paradigm today are the old institutions of capitalism, industrialism that are coming back to haunt us, for example, through woke culture today. What does it mean to deal, effectively deal, affirmatively deal with the ghosts of the old paradigm? What does that mean? Good book title, by the way, someone was picking up. But the ghosts of the old paradigm. And what does it mean to then embrace and personify the spirits of the new paradigm? This is where Hegel and Nietzsche meet. And what they say is this: if I, as a philosopher, am incapable of personifying the spirit of the new paradigm, I'm perfectly happy to declare that somebody else will, but I will then lay the ground for him to do so. And this is, again, Middle Eastern philosophy, being the Bob. It's like you could be John the Baptist. You don't have to be Christ. Like, if you are in a position, historically speaking, that you see this clearly, and you are a philosopher, you can be prophetic enough to say that I do not have the strength to do this, or I have the friends that I can do this with. I cannot personify the proletariat. I cannot personify the Overman, but I can declare the Overman is to come, and I can declare the proletariat will win. But I can do so and then allow somebody else to personify that later. And this exactly what the two-headed phallus plays in so richly, because I can declare from history and the necessity of history, and by being in the amor fati spirit, within the spirit of amor fati, I can declare through the will to intelligence, that I pursued my entire life. I can declare that this is to come. And therefore, somebody else can personify it and build the will to transcendence, and it's not going to be me. And that's exactly how you avoid becoming tyrannical if you're Hegelian and Nietzsche, by splitting the two.
All right, that's a fantastic overview there, Bard, and also shout out to you and your work, because I think, as I think you've said to me personally off recording, it's not enough to just be a philosopher of Nietzsche and just repeat what Nietzsche said, for example, but really you are someone as a philosopher inspired by Nietzsche, someone who is generating a very innovative perspective using Nietzsche, but certainly not reducible to Nietzsche, and someone who is definitely making sense of our time in a way that I think is quite unique and singular. So thanks for coming on.
I would add this. We are currently stuck in a logos versus pathos deadlock.
Mm-hmm.
The logos versus mythos deadlock.
I can tell you I am.
We're obsessed with logos mythos all the time, right? The pathos was lacking, and that's going to come back to haunt us. Yeah. We are creating a pathic pressure cooker in our culture today. I think we have to understand that quickly. The extreme right, young men joining the extreme right today and pursuing the things to do. A lot of young philosophy interested students that they want to read Evola Genon, they want to read all these they come back to us with all this, what I call the Hindus of history, the Hindus of philosophy. The obsession with these guys is that these voices seem phallic. And we wrote in Digital Libido, you should be warned here, is that unless we take Nietzsche seriously today and understand the power of the pathos, unless we take that seriously, we will have a lot of young men who will go for the fake follows. And that's exactly what happened in the 1930s. So ironically, Nietzsche is the best weapon we could have against the 1930s being repeated when we ended up at Hitler and Stalin. What we must do today is to look at what Nietzsche is saying. Nietzsche is saying that unless the pathos blows up in between the logos and the mythos, if you try to keep the pathos down, like I'd say that Nietzsche is the pornography of the history of philosophy. He's the pornographer of philosophy. That's what Nietzsche is. And if anybody wants to get pornography out of culture today, I warn you deeply. That's somebody who wants to have sutra with a tantra locked in, and that we cannot do any longer. We have to live with both realms today. And I think Nietzsche reminds us of the importance of the tantric, and it reminds us the importance of the pressure cooker. And if anybody should inspire new esoteric cults or whatever guys are up to these days, and lodges and orders and things that I prophesize we got to have digital, it's got to be Nietzsche. Absolutely.
Well, I think there's no better sort of segue for me to remind everyone that not only is this the end of the Nietzsche Dialogues, but it's also the start of the Thus Spoke Zarathustra course. So if you're interested in basically what Bard is saying here, that we cannot build the new culture without thinking the pathos. And if you want to understand the pathos, you, especially within the philosophical perspective, you have to understand Nietzsche. And Thus Spoke Zarathustra is an incredibly important and critical text in Nietzsche's overall canon to really start to get to understand what Nietzsche is talking about and really what's at stake here in working with Nietzsche in the 21st century. So if you're interested in signing up and joining me this summer, it'll be a 9-week program. There'll be 6 different courses. There'll be 3 different tiers. You can work with me at the level of a recording. You can work with me at the level of live classes, and you can work with me on the level of one-on-one as well. All the information is on philosophyportal.online, and the final day to sign up is July 15th in just a couple of days. So Bard, this has been the Nietzsche Dialogues. Thank you so much for ending this. I can't think of a better man or a better philosopher to have this conversation with. And I think it's been incredibly rich for me. So thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.